welcome everyone to the Ellig Group webinar, Steady Hands on the Wheel, Keeping Narcissists Out of the Corner Office. I'm Nicole Sanford, the Board Services Leader for Ellig Group, which is a leading search and advisory firm located in New York City that has been dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion since its inception. I'll be the host for today's discussion, which is part of a series that we've put together for thought leaders and other experts in some really challenging and unusual times. I think we can all agree. We'll spend the next 60 minutes or so together. I couldn't be more delighted to have two fantastic subject matter experts with us today. So I'm going to do an introduction of each before we jump right into the subject matter of the day. Dr. Jennifer Chatman is the Paul J. Cortese Distinguished Professor of Management at the Haas Management Organizations Group. She teaches, research, and consults on leveraging organizational culture, leading change, and managing complex teams. Professor Chatman is the co-director of the Berkeley Haas Culture Initiative, the Associate Dean for Learning Strategies, an editor for the journal Research and Organizational Behavior, and runs the Leading Strategy Execution Through Culture Executive Education program. Professor Chatman earned her PhD at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley and her BA in psychology from UC Berkeley. Joe Kelly is a highly sought after strategic advisor to the C-suite and board of some of the world's most complex oil and gas, industrial, telecommunications, aerospace and defense, and financial services companies. An executive leader with a unique set of professional experiences, his expertise spans a number of critical disciplines, including digital, talent strategic transformation, mergers and acquisitions, board and executive compensation design, and valuation and actuarial modeling, and a whole list of other things that I couldn't fit into this brief introduction. Over his 30 plus years at Deloitte, he served many of the firm's most important clients, led human capital service areas throughout the United States, and chaired the firm's nominating committee before retiring just last year to concentrate on board service. I've had the good fortune of knowing and working with both of these fantastic professionals, and we're just going to have a great conversation today. Thank you guys again for being with us and taking some time to join us. Jenny, this whole idea for our webinar started because you shared your paper with me, and I have a pretty well marked up and highlighted copy to prove how much I enjoyed it. But you published a paper called Transformational Leader or Narcissist: How Grandiose Narcissists Can Create and Destroy Organizations and Institutions, which just won an award, I believe, from the California Management Review. So congratulations, I'm not surprised. It was a fantastic paper and a great read. I think Joe's copy is just as dog-eared as mine, so I think we both really enjoyed it. So before we go too far, just give us a little bit of context. What led you to study narcissistic leaders, and where did the data take you?
Well, thanks, Nicole. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me and for your very kind words about the paper. I kind of wish we didn't have to study this because it's a problem, and narcissism is particularly a problem at senior levels of organizations. I'm mostly a culture and leadership researcher and consultant. And as you know, Nicole, I also am an independent director at a publicly traded company. So I think about the impact that leaders have on an organization's fate, on their performance, on the experience that employees have, how they do over time, and so forth. And one thing I began to notice is that senior leaders, particularly CEOs, were often very overconfident. And I wanted to see whether this actually was a persistent trait or something that was caused by simply being in the CEO position, that there was something about gaining that power that led people to be overconfident. And so we did some research early on. My colleague, Charles O'Reilly, has been my partner in crime on this research. He's at Stanford University. And what we found first off was that leaders are disproportionately high on what's called trait narcissism. There's a way to measure narcissism, which means that it's a stable kind of enduring trait. And what we know is that narcissists tend to seek out leadership roles. So that's part of it. But the other side of the coin is just as important, which is that we as consumers of leadership, whether you're a director on a board hiring a new CEO, or a leader of an organization hiring your next set of leaders, we are at times biased consumers of leadership. And if you would think about two Venn diagrams, one is a visionary leader, right, who has big ideas and inspires people and articulates an effective strategy, and another who is a narcissist, which is characterized by grandiosity and in many cases high levels of charisma, and in many cases a short-term ability to really sway people. Those Venn diagrams overlap quite consistently. And so I started doing research to see whether the consumer side could do a little bit better job separating out what we know to be effective leadership from what have become very apparent downsides of narcissism.
So tell me, from where you sit, are people born narcissists, or is this something that sort of develops over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And when we're talking about narcissism, it turns out that it's a very persistent trait. By definition, a trait is something that is almost developed at the kind of genetic level, and it is a propensity to behave in a particular way across a wide range of situations, right? So there's high consistency around it. There is a little bit of evidence that as people move up organizational hierarchies, they may have a tendency to lose what we call impulse control, that greater power causes people to get a little bit sloppy in terms of their consideration for others and sharing the spotlight. But that effect kind of pales in comparison to what we know about the people who are consistently high on narcissism. And those people are, as I said, overrepresented in the ranks of CEOs, to the tune of about 10% among CEOs, versus at the kind of baseline level in society at large, high narcissists, about 2%.
I guess in some ways that's a good thing that they're sort of consistent, because hopefully, as we're going to talk about in a little while, that means there's sort of evidence of this, that if you follow the trail, you'll see. In my time coaching boards and CEOs, I used to call this the Tom Cruise syndrome, where as you get more and more famous, as he got more and more famous, I think a lot of the people who were around him to tell him when he was behaving a little bit crazy started to drop off, and nobody wanted to tell him. And then before you know it, he's jumping up on a couch with Oprah. So I think it's true that these are consistent traits, but as you grow in power, people are a lot less likely to raise their hand and tell you when you're behaving in an inappropriate or unacceptable way, perhaps.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's also the case that narcissists tend to surround themselves with people who agree with them. They are irritated when they're challenged, and they tend to dispense with people who are naysayers of their ideas. That's definitely true. They also don't share the spotlight. So anyone who is interested in getting credit for their work, is not well served by a narcissist. So, and we'll talk about this later, I know, but one of the kind of signature attributes of narcissists is that they typically don't bring a stable group of people along with them.
It's really interesting. So it leads you to the question, which is, why should we care? What are the implications or impacts of having a narcissistic leader at the helm?
Yeah, well, it's actually quite serious. And this justified our suspicion and our interest in pursuing this path. There are a couple of very consequential elements. One is that narcissists create organizational cultures that are characterized by lower integrity and lower collaboration. And you might think, well, maybe in exchange for being really results oriented, that's okay. But if you think about it, collaboration and integrity are the backbones of organizational longevity. Collaboration is, an obvious one. It answers the question, why bother to be an organization? Well, you're an organization because you can do something together that you couldn't do individually or in smaller groups. So that means that collaboration is absolutely essential. And of course, integrity is about delivering on your promises in a consistent way. And if you don't do that, your very survival is threatened. So that's one issue, is that we know that narcissists create less functional cultures. And furthermore, even after they leave, our research showed that there's a residue that they leave on the culture that outlasts their tenure. So that's problematic. And then the second thing I would point to is that narcissists have a very insensitive orientation towards risk. We did very, very careful research, experimental research with random assignments so we could actually understand the causal relationships here. And what we found was that narcissists were essentially insensitive to very, very high levels of risk. And they would take the risk anyway because they're overconfident about their ideas. And that is not good for organizations. We found that organizations led by CEOs who were high in narcissism were significantly more likely to be embroiled in lawsuits. Those lawsuits were more expensive, and yet they were no more likely to win those lawsuits, even though they persisted over long periods of time. So there are very significant detrimental consequences. And we haven't even talked about sort of the personnel issues and the lack of an interest in sharing the spotlight with others and giving them credit and developing them.
Joe, I'm sure that you have, in your experience as someone who's advised really large, complex organizations, I'm sure you have examples to point to as well. But how does this track with what you saw in your practice over your 30-plus-year career?
Yeah, I think, and by the way, the paper is fascinating. I would recommend everybody take the chance to read it, but because I recognized a lot of things that I've seen through the years as I've dealt with people both inside Deloitte and outside of the clients. But I agree. I don't think narcissists are made. I think they're born. I'll use a different example than what you had, Nicole, about Tom Cruise. A couple of us used to talk on our elected leaders succession committee about certainly as people got to senior levels of the organization, they'd take the blue pill and think that they were now in charge of everything, and everything was great because of them, and they made no mistakes, and so they didn't always pay attention to reality on things. So absolutely have seen that. And I do think, however, that oftentimes people will not necessarily pick up on it quite as much because as Jenny said, these people tend to look for leadership roles. They want to get in them. If they charm the people in front of them or upwards of them, they might get put through a series of different roles through the years. And as a result, they're never there long enough for you to actually see or get the kinds of results that you can understand what the real impact is going to be. I do think that the morale, particularly of senior leadership teams, and you touched on this, Jenny, can degrade over time. I've seen examples where there's a growing dichotomy in pay between the CEO and direct reports or senior leaders. It doesn't even have to be a CEO. It could be somebody who's a business unit president who's making their way up that way. And they'll tell the direct reports you're going to be taken care of over time. So those are kinds of things that you can see that's out there. I also read another study recently because I was interested in this one. There's other academic research that's been done that narcissistic CEOs tend to exercise a lot more earnings management, up and down, which was interesting than you see in a lot of other places. And so, that with the risk and, heightened levels of M&A is in there. And then the other thing is, and you said this, Jenny, about the residue, I agree completely. They don't leave good successors behind them. And that's one thing that you have to, as you look at processes, need to be paying attention to is, are people actually being able to develop and coach and mentor? And narcissists, by definition, aren't very good at helping other people be, hugely successful, at least in my experience. I don't know, Jenny, if you had anything else you'd add in there.
Thanks, Joe. It's really, when you talk about earnings management, there's an attorney, Mike Young, who was with Wilkie Farr. He's probably still there. He was the lead investigator for a number of the major financial frauds that happened at the turn of the century. And when he would talk to boards about that, he would talk about the fact that this person who had been perpetuating this massive fraud really started to cast his net throughout the organization. And by the time everything came to light, he liked to say there was only 3 people left who didn't know that this person was a toxic narcissist, and all 3 of them were on the audit committee. So I'd love to hear, Jenny, both in terms of your research, but also in terms of your experience for a board. Why do boards get fooled, and how are these people able to charm their way through? And that'll hopefully lead us to a discussion of what they can do to prevent it.
Without getting ridiculously clinical, there's a subsection of narcissist which is called grandiose narcissists. And grandiose narcissists end up having these big ideas and the ability to capture the imagination of their followers early on. So what Joe said is exactly right. It's a temporal phenomenon, which is that narcissists have the ability to make a very, very good first impression. They are charismatic. They have big, interesting ideas. They have a kind of appealing confidence that the idea can actually get implemented. And so we get sort of lulled into and inspired into thinking that this is something that could actually happen. And, typically, one of the problems is that narcissists tend to seek out leadership roles. So they push very hard and in enough cases get promoted so that by the time they are, at the board level, they have a level of legitimacy and credibility. And the board, again, can also be swayed into thinking that their rise to leadership is a proof point that perhaps they're a good leader. And these are problematic assumptions. And of course, what I recommend for boards, and what our board indeed focuses on, is being really, really disciplined in how you vet people. And I think one of the most important elements of sort of avoiding the trap is doing really thorough due diligence, of the sort that Ellig does, right? Really thorough due diligence, not just the list of people who the candidate puts forth for him or herself, but a really wide net. We want to know what the patterns and trends are of, everyone that this person has touched. And what we're looking for is statements about whether this network felt that the leader invested in them or not, and worked on developing them or not, and shared credit or not, and gave them developmental experiences or not. And that's a really important step to take. The other piece of it is to fact check the grandiose ideas. And really put them through a rigorous test to see what the feasibility is, and not to be swayed by the data and grand ideas that the narcissist is presenting. And I know these seem really commonsensical, but I think what our research suggests is that boards and hiring managers need to be even more vigilant than they've been in the past. Because we now see a statistically significant, stable pattern with these very negative consequences. And so dialing up the vigilance, I think, is quite important.
Joe, I'd love some comments on that, but I'd also love to hear, because I know you've given a lot of thought to, the how this happens, how somebody kind of rises up. And how that's different when you're hiring from the outside versus promoting from within. So I'd love to hear a little more about that.
Yeah, my perspective, and Jenny, we talked about this briefly in preparation for this. Inside, you've got a lot more opportunity and ability to check up on these things. You can put processes in place and do things like getting true, full 360-degree feedback. And you're going to have some kind of process in place where that feedback can be captured through people that are highly trusted by, other leaders in the organization, so that they know their job's not going to be at risk if they're giving the feedback back on some of these different people. You have to make it truly confidential, and you've got to find a way, to do that. Some people have set people, or, could be board members, it could be, the head of HR or other places like that, where you can get to the level of confidentiality you need to get on everything. But I think that's, highly critical. I think having a full process in place where you can track somebody throughout their career and looking for a number of different kinds of developmental opportunities for them. You want to be able to see that they're able to lead through both influence as well as hierarchy, so they don't just get given the role, because to lead by influence, you're going to have to be able to bring people along to what your idea is, convince them of the ability to do that, convince them that it's good for their own, career to come along on all this. And so it's not just a grandiose vision. So that influence versus hierarchy, I think, is important. I think putting people in sustainable roles, so that it's not just you're rolling somebody through different roles every year and a half or 2 years, so that they have to see a full strategy put in place, and to see if it works, and if it doesn't work, how they respond to all that. These are all the kinds of things, I think, if you can, check that out. And you can also do things then, if you're an organization that does things like measures your culture and the level of commitment and collaboration and things like that. There are different tools that exist in the marketplace, and many organizations do that. And you can do cuts of those both at an organization-wide level, or if these leaders are coming down the path for their particular area, to pick up on some of the things Jenny was just mentioning about what happens in a culture that's out there. And then I think you also can, track their ability and success to create strong people who will come in behind them as they go on to another role and immediately be successful. So you've got a lot of tools, and there are more. And Jenny, I know you've got a bunch more that you've written about as well. But those are a number of different things that if you stay on top of it, you can see that work. And some of the most sophisticated organizations, I had a big oil and gas company that could tell you who the top half dozen candidates for CEO are 10 years from now, because they track it down to that level, and they're managing their careers very carefully and closely, and they've got characteristics and traits and behaviors they're looking for that they track on. And I remember when some new board members came on at that organization, they were shocked to hear that they could absolutely track somebody like that until they saw the data on things. So there's a possibility to do it. It takes a lot of time and effort, and it's an investment. But to Jenny's point, the downsides are huge. For the outside hires, I don't know that I have a lot of other things to do other than dig a little deeper into some of the behavioral interviewing techniques. You want to understand and get them to talk about where they have failed in the past, and see, do they go into blaming? Do they say, well, I did everything right, it was those guys who did something different on that? Is there a we? Is it we as a team came together and did all this? You're looking for things like, how are they building collaboration that's out there? But I think Jenny hit most of the high points if you're interviewing outside for that level of diligence. Jenny, I'm sure I missed some. You're the PhD in this area, so.
I mean, that was a great list. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I would add just 2 points, which is, well, it's really one bigger point, which is, once you start using these approaches, you really have to go all in. You can't assess people and then hedge and make exceptions. I'm thinking of Netflix, which has been a wildly successful company. Let me just give you an interesting comparison about Netflix in terms of how important people are to that organization. So Netflix has, last time I checked, their market cap is somewhere in the 275 billion range. They achieved that with 9,600 people. If you compare them to Disney is about 75 billion more, but they do that with 130,000 people. So Netflix does 70% of the market cap of Disney with 4% of the people. And what that means is that each hire is incredibly leveraged. So the cost for someone, for example, who is not collaborative is immense. And Netflix has an orientation. It's much like the old General Electric orientation, which is every year the 10%, is gone. Netflix is constantly asking the opportunity cost question, right? Is this person a superstar? If not, we can't really afford to keep them, right? And the question managers are asked to think about constantly is, if this person were to get an offer from a competitor, would you fight hard to keep them? If not, we offer them a generous severance package and we bring in people who are superstars. And part of being a superstar at Netflix involves incredible collaboration because, right, if you're doing $275 billion with 9,600 people, that means that the level of collaboration has to be sort of off the charts.
Yeah, you guys are raising some really interesting points. In my experience, to your point, Joe, and to what you added, Jenny, around once you decide to use some of these tools, you have to go all in. My experience is that that's where things start to fall apart. A lot of organizations will do 360s, but they'll allow the person to keep that insight private instead of making it so that the supervisor of that person can actually see. And also not making it sort of ironclad that people really trust that the feedback is confidential, and so therefore they don't give the trusted feedback. What I always like to say is, you want to make your environment really uncomfortable for these people, and you want to have processes in place that will weed them out as early as possible. And so they aren't successful because they're not comfortable. They want to leave because they're the only one there who's behaving the way that they're behaving, to your earlier point, Jenny. So, I think it's really fascinating. A lot of the things you talked about, Joe, have been around for a long time. They're not necessarily new concepts. In your opinion, how much better are we as organizations executing them well than we were 15, 20 years ago? And how do companies take that next big leap forward?
So I think we're better. I still think we have a long ways to go. We still have there are many organizations that are out there that is part of their set of core company, values and stuff like that is they want to, both be collaborative, but almost nice is the term I would use. And so they get too nice. And so they don't have the courage to deliver direct messages that need to be delivered while people are going through their career. And so that's why, when I was working at Deloitte, there was a tool we had that over time, as we started to measure things, one of the topics that became more important to people was, are we building a culture within the organization that allows for the courage to have the kinds of dialogues and discussions, and have those kinds of career discussions with people and guidance and coaching that you need to give them in order to make sure you do cut that off at the head. And, Jenny, I love the way you put it when you said, is this somebody we would fight for if they were going to get a job offer, somewhere else? Well, that's a conversation you need to be having with that person at that point in time if you end up doing, that kind of thing. And not everybody's always going to stay at every organization. Not everybody's going to be a leader in the organization. But I still think most organizations have a hard time telling people that and having that kind of dialogue. And until you can get to that point where I think some of the best performing companies in the country have that kind of culture because they are having those kind of regular dialogues, and it became a cultural value or a company value that said it's more important for us to make sure we're being as effective as possible and collaborative, but truthful and respectful to drive the best performance we can. And that means all of us have to be open with each other, but that's a two-way street, and we don't always see that.
I think there are a number of organizations, Nicole, that you could point to that are doing a really good job. We may not like them, but they are very, very consistent in insisting that people adhere to the culture that they believe supports their strategic goals. And I'm thinking of Goldman Sachs, I'm thinking of Amazon. I'm thinking of Netflix, which I mentioned already. These are strong cultural organizations, Southwest Airlines, which we've been hearing about for years and years. These are organizations that don't tolerate people undermining the culture. And I'm reminded of a case that a colleague of mine who is at Apple, Morton Hansen, also a professor at the information school at UC Berkeley, who's written a wonderful book on collaboration. He wrote a case on an investment bank that competed with Goldman Sachs and was trying to emulate Goldman Sachs' collaborative culture. And the collaborative culture at Goldman Sachs is an intentional strategy for them, right? We want people inside to be collaborative, because if people leave, we don't want clients to go with them, right? So that's essential. So this competitor organization, as the case goes, had a case where there was a very, very high performer who was a wonderful salesperson, but who really didn't treat internal teams very well. He was great with customers, great with clients, and terrible internally. And the investment bank turned a blind eye to his internal behavior. And of course, moral of the story, they never achieved the culture that they said they were trying to create. So I really think there has to be a serious commitment to even trading off valuable other attributes like, well, this person is a high performer, if you care about things like integrity and collaboration.
Yeah, Jenny, to your earlier point, they may look on paper to be a high performer, but it may very well be that they're just taking credit for everybody else's work. I think we've all seen those examples in your research, and some of the examples you raised in your paper, and some of the things I've read, and even in my own personal experience. Somebody might look like the best performer in the company, but they might just be really great at gaming the system to take full credit for the people that work for them. And so you have to be a little bit more, I think, discriminating in looking at that performance. To your point, we do have a question in the chat that I'm going to take before we move on, because it's a really good one. I have some thoughts, but I'm going to let you guys answer first, and then I'll come back around. Any advice for us on a senior leadership team with this sort of narcissistic CEO? Your comments about degraded morale, irritated when challenged, and take credit for others' work rings so true. Our company used a well-known search firm, and clearly no one did the thorough due diligence. I'm really hoping they're not implying that we did. I'm sure that's not the case. But it's an excellent question. So all the preventative medicine failed. Now the narcissist is there. Senior leadership team, what do they do? And Jenny, let's start with you, and then Joe, you can weigh in.
Well, first, Barbara, I'm sorry. It is a very difficult situation for you. What I would try to do is, in managing upward, I would try to set up as many situations where you can negotiate with the leader for, I can't tell if it's him or her. Unfortunately, it's usually him. According to the research, so I'll just assume that base rate. If you can point out to the leader goals that he has in mind that he wants to achieve, and you can negotiate to help him achieve those goals in exchange for the things that the team wants, including credit and references and whatever else is of use to you. It's going to have to be a more instrumental relationship, sadly, and I don't think you can wait for the leader to gain an intrinsic interest in developing followers. In fact, the point that Joe made earlier about narcissistic CEOs and compensation over time, we've done research that showed, statistically, this was very carefully done quantitative research, that narcissistic CEOs tended to diverge from the senior team's compensation level over time, whereas non-narcissistic leaders tended to converge. Not exactly the opposite, right? I need a whiteboard, but tended to converge with the top management team's compensation over time, which is the manifestation of sharing credit, right? If you think that people are in it together and that you're a team working together, then there ought to be convergence in the rewards people get for the accomplishments that they have. So I'm really sorry that you're missing this. My sense is you should try this instrumental negotiation. And at some point, if the board isn't recognizing these characteristics, at some point it actually is worth considering leaving.
Yeah, and my reaction to this would be, this is one of the reasons why I think boards have to make sure they've got processes in place so that they're regularly able to get the feedback if they're seeing this from the senior leadership or executive leadership teams, where they understand everything that's going on in a confidential way, not to undermine, they're not management. Got to be clear, it's not the board's role, but it is their role to make sure that the right kinds of things are getting done. And if there is an issue, that messages get carried back to the CEO and the CEO's annual, or semi-annual, or however often of a review you're giving to them on things, because they're not going to know it unless they have a process in place. So to your point, Jenny, people can end up leaving, which the board should be identifying if they start seeing people leaving, or the board will start reaching out directly to get perspectives on the QT to understand what it is, so they can undertake a process then to try to figure out what's going on and see if they can get some curbs put in place or make some other considerations. So
yeah, I mean, it's such a great point that you would want to encourage a board to have regular contact, confidential contact with the senior team, perhaps at times without the CEO. From Barbara's perspective, there's a risk there to kind of going over the CEO's head. Yeah. But if the senior team knows that there is consulting work being done, for example, on board governance, they could reach out to the consulting firm in confidence and ask if the consultants can advise the board to increase their level of monitoring of succession planning within the organization. That's a fair request.
That's a great idea.
A reasonable request. It can be made in a very non-political way, and you don't even have to implicate the CEO in that kind of a request.
Yeah, I had an opportunity to catch up with Dr. Marilyn York, who's a strategic partner of ours at Ellig Group this week, as we were preparing, sort of pick her brain a little bit. She wrote a great book called The Office Survival Guide, and there's a whole section in there about how to deal with, the words are a little different, but what we're really talking about is narcissists. If your boss is a narcissist, and some tools to help identify what kind of a person you're dealing with. And then some tools as to how to tailor your approach. I think also it's important. It's an important part. I don't want to say that I don't want to comment on the search process that you went through for this for your company, but it is important that tools like assessments, a Hogan assessment, even for certain CEOs, boards may want to have a more deep dive on psychological profile, and there are tools and people who specialize in that, including Marilyn and others. But I also want to point out that we often will encourage boards who are replacing the CEO, even if you're pretty sure that you're going to promote from within. Having a firm help you scan the market and interview everybody, including your internal candidates, put them through the same process, and give you an independent view as to how the person you're about to promote compares with the outsiders that are available, and the process that we've been talking about. Put them through the same rigorous process you would put them through if you were hiring from the outside, maybe even a little more because you have better data, right? So, I think that's some advice to give. There are a couple more questions, and I want to make sure I leave a few minutes to talk about compensation, because I think you raised some good points. But let's talk about, can narcissists be redirected? Can they contribute in certain roles or be contained, or must they be cut loose from the organization? Joe, you start.
I think if they're truly the grandiose narcissists and the ones who, brook no challenge, on things, I think it's hard because now you're truly taking them on. And some of the experiences that I've had and, dealing with some of the folks, you kind of take them on and they just get mad at you and they ultimately end up leaving. I think if you catch people earlier in their career and they may still have it, but can you redirect some of it? I think it's possible. You've probably got more experience at this because you did much more research, Jenny. I'd be interested on your answer to that particular question because, again, I think there's degrees. It's a spectrum of how narcissistic people are. The ones who are all the way off on one end of the chart, I think, are going to be hard, to keep around. But I think if they're further back down and you can redirect and guide some of it, there might be some hope there. Jenny?
Yeah, I can't say I disagree, Joe. The key is figuring out how to contain the goals that they're pursuing. And because their motives are so individualistic, it's really hard to think about important goals in an organization that, that only one person sort of pursues or benefits from. I think it's difficult, and I think the filtering processes initially are what you want to worry about. Interestingly, we just finished a study that showed that when you ask the question who narcissists prefer to work with, and this is slightly tangential, but I'll come back to why this is somewhat of an answer to this question. We thought that narcissists might prefer to work with people who are not narcissists because they could exploit them more regularly. But it turns out that narcissists, even when you measure this in a very indirect way, they prefer and benefit from working with other narcissists. And the reason is because they understand the likely behavior that other narcissists are likely to emit. It's very aggressive, assertive, boastful, grandiose, And so what I would say is if you're going to have a narcissist, you might as well have a group of narcissists who pursue something because they're going to be more productive together and less difficult for people with a greater sense of humility and so forth. So if there's some place where you can take risk in your organization, perhaps you could have a set of narcissists together. It's a little bit out of the box idea. I'm not saying I advocate it.
Well, that's helpful to have out of the box ideas. I think in this case, we need a lot of them. We have another question in the chat box. Aren't narcissists classically unself-aware? Do they even respond to feedback, or do they immediately go to blame? Have you seen any, and I guess maybe part of this is, well, if you have someone who can't accept feedback, you sort of, as a board, giving a CEO feedback, if they can't accept it, maybe that's a pretty big red flag. But have you seen anything that would contradict that, or practices that could be employed for feedback? Either one of you can jump in on that one.
Yeah, so narcissists are incredibly self-aware, but they like who they are, so they don't accept feedback. So in fact, the most valid way to measure narcissism is to ask people a single item question. There are much more complex ways of doing this. There's a more accepted 40-item survey, but the one item, which is, are you a narcissist? That's among the most valid ways of assessing narcissism. So people are often proud of that. So they are self-aware, but they are not open to feedback, okay? Because they think that who they are is good. So
wait, Jenny, you're saying if you ask a narcissist, are you a narcissist? They're likely to say, yeah, I am absolutely a narcissist.
And I like it.
Fascinating.
Right. I like that I'm grandiose. I like that I have big ideas. I like that I'm out for myself. I don't see any reason to change.
That's fascinating. I had never heard that before. That's probably worth the price of admission today, just to have you tell us that. I have some other questions, but I want to talk about compensation, because that is one area where the board is completely in control, right? It's through the comp committee. Compensating the CEO. You talked a little bit about it, Jenny, in terms of the data that you saw and how, narcissistic or grandiose narcissistic CEOs comp tends to trend over time. Joe, this has always been a big part of what you've done for boards and for senior executives. Let's talk a little bit about how compensation can be used as a tool to identify, weed out, disincentivize, however you want to take it.
Well, so it's already been discussed earlier, and I think Jenny said it earlier about, her research that's done that shows the, is it diverging versus converging, between the narcissistic and non-narcissistic CEOs. And so as a comp committee, you can, track that over time. And many comp committees also have responsibility for succession planning. And so you, can have a weigh in out of the comp committee to understand, what's going on and understand who's coming along behind you and see how they're being developed and keep track of all that. The proxy advisory firms, spend a lot of time focusing in on the whole idea around how CEO pay is structured. What are all the elements of it? Are you using appropriate peer groups or aspirational peer groups? So you want to make sure that you're not, if you got a grandiose narcissistic CEO, they might start comparing themselves or wanting to compare themselves to peer groups that are actually bigger, more successful than the organization they work for. And I've also seen at times where you can get executives who, well, we want to get to targets of the 75th percentile, in each of the different areas, and all of a sudden you're at the 90th percentile on things that are out there. And so you've got to be careful how you put it together, and it's got to be both a total cash comp and a total comp view on what you're structuring that's in there. The other thing you got to be careful of, and you touched on this earlier too, Jenny, is about the outsized risk taking that's out there. The kinds of structures you put in place will drive the narcissistic CEO to decide what they're going to focus on and what they're going to work towards. And it's part of why you see, to the earnings management comment I made earlier, you see them sometimes manage earnings down in 1 year because they're going for a longer term thing that's out there. So these are all the kinds of things that I think if you're a compensation committee member, you have to be on the lookout for. And there's so many moving parts, and compensation is so complex with all the different pieces that are out there that you need to do it. And it's also interesting because I think you see more and more boards using, their own compensation consultant, with management having a separate compensation consultant, that's out there. And that's part of the reason I think behind some of that, so that you're not just getting what the CEO's view is of what they want to do. You're able to get some of the other pieces. So I think there's a number of moving parts out there, and it's actually one of the ways the board can get into this a little bit more. And I'm sure I've missed some things here, Jenny, if you want to add on.
Yeah, I guess a couple of things. One is that in my board experience, we have done a very good job of linking compensation to strategic goals. Mm-hmm. But we haven't done as good a job at linking compensation to the CEO's goals. And what I mean by that is the CEO goals are typically things that have more to do with, restructuring, succession planning, developing people, getting systems up and running and so forth. And I'm not sure the answer there is necessarily linking to straight compensation, but creating certainly some contingencies around succession planning is vitally important. And, the board should be aware of the senior team's perspective. We talked about this a bit earlier, as well as the concrete actions that the CEO is taking to develop his or her team. And that should be front and center. It should be reported on regularly. We have used extensively consulting firms to give us independent assessments of our candidates, our internal candidates, as well as external candidates. And those processes, I think, are absolutely vital. And then, again, I'm on these two themes of, development as a shortcoming of narcissists and grandiose ideas that end up not bearing fruit. So if you find, for example, that your acquisition strategy in the firm is never quite taken to completion, that's worth asking some questions about. Is the CEO overpromising? Are you measuring successes and failures and keeping track? I think acquisitions is a really important way of doing that, because the projections are rosy up front and it's much harder to measure whether you achieve that. So really some of those disciplined practices of evaluating performance beyond just the elements that are linked to compensation per se.
Making sure that they're not just getting rewarded because the market itself is doing well,
Right.
but it's tying to what their strategy is. And I think that's the key point that, needs to be in there. So.
Yeah, and from a good governance perspective, I guess what I would say is if you even think that you might be dealing with a narcissistic CEO, it's probably worthwhile to really dig into things like the quality of your earnings with your auditors in your executive sessions. Like, tell us about the parts of the financial statements where there were a couple of different ways to go, right? And that our leader took you to the best possible outcome, right? So now there's a lot more disclosure of that now than there used to be in terms of audit committee reporting that's being done from the auditors. But the bottom line is there's no better way to know, as a former audit partner, I can tell you, than to just look the audit partner in the eye and say, tell me about the quality of our earnings this quarter. And I think you always can get a little bit of a different sort of feel for what's really going on if you dig in. And I think it's all about, you don't have to know for sure. You don't have to have a psychological profile proving that you're dealing with a grandiose narcissist. If you think you might, then you as a board member have a responsibility to probably beef up some of those underlying.
Yeah, I just would say goodwill is one of those litmus tests, right? Because it's so discretionary, right? You want to look for those discretionary elements. So I think
valuations, right, Joe? All those complex valuations that you know so well. So we're gonna come up on time soon. There was a couple more interesting questions. One is sort of very specific to this time, so I thought I'd ask some people asking, in your experience and kind of what you're seeing, this kind of back to work, back to the office, how different types of CEOs seem to be developing a plan for the return to the office. The person asked, is this really just an ego thing with the CEO? Jenny, I'm sure people are asking you for your opinion about this. What's your perspective?
Well, we haven't studied it yet, but anecdotally, I think there might be something to what the person is asking about. What I've noticed, I've probably tracked 20, 30 firms and what they're doing in terms of returning. The smart CEOs, I'm not saying whether they're non-narcissists or not, but the smart CEOs are recognizing that there are a host of benefits for having greater flexibility about where people work. And, in the professional realm, professional services and those kinds of industries where there is flexibility, employees are definitely asking for greater flexibility. There are some CEOs I've heard already who are like not interested. We're going back as soon as we can. We're going to do exactly what we used to do before. And I don't know whether that's a sign of narcissism or not, but I think that kind of negation of a recognition that A, employees want it, and B, it's plausible, and people probably don't need to be taking trips to London for a 1-hour meeting, which I have been guilty of doing, that there are better ways of doing that. I think that's just smart leadership, and it's going to save you money in real estate, and it's going to make your organization more appealing to a broader range of employees. So I just think that closed-mindedness could be problematic. I don't know whether it's associated with narcissism.
Yeah, I'm not convinced it's associated just with narcissism. I think some of it has to do, particularly in some of the more traditional industries where everybody was always in there, and if you weren't at your desk, I couldn't be sure you were working, and so I want you at your desk. And I've seen and heard that from different folks, and I do think that the folks who are pushing hard to do that right now without listening to any of it or trying to make flexibility are paying prices in retention already at this point. I mean, I see it come through on my LinkedIn and talking to people and to old clients and stuff. I think it is a lost opportunity in leadership, and board members ought to be, thinking about and paying attention to some of that. And if you start to see, tick ups in turnover and things, I also think that it gives you an opportunity to manage expense, and try to make an organization more profitable. You're bypassing the ability, to leverage things in much different ways, to your meetings, the 1 hour meeting, to having consultants, having lived the consultant lifestyle for nearly 40 years. Do I really have to be there 5 days a week, every week, or can we do different things? That saves money for, the customer too, because they're not paying for my plane flights and hotels and everything too. So there's opportunities. And I think if anything, if nothing else, people show that they could work and work highly productively during this whole pandemic. And it drove a rapid change, that was out there, that I think we will feel. But again, I'm not convinced it's just narcissists who are doing that. So.
It's a call to action for boards for sure, because as representatives of the shareholders and other stakeholders, there's going to be, if you believe what we're reading, the war for talent that's on the horizon right now is going to be like something we haven't seen before. And the shortage now may be because of stimulus, maybe because of unemployment, but who knows? But all of the projections I've ever seen have shown that the talent squeeze is coming in a way that we actually really don't appreciate fully yet. And as a board member, I think asking the CEO, why are we pushing this so hard? How is this going to impact our ability to retain the best people, and how in our war for the best talent? So we have a great question about the gender differences. I think we're going to run out of time, but Jenny, I'm going to ask if after this you can maybe help me find something that might be good reading material on that. Because I'd love to hear. I wish we had more time. I read every single thing that's been written about the Theranos case, because it's just so fascinating. And one of those examples where, one of the few examples we have of very public. Now, part of that could be we don't have as many female CEOs, and when we get there, we'll have just as many narcissistic CEOs as everybody else. That's a high-class problem for us to have. But after we go, I'll ask you to help me give some guidance to that question and a few more. But this was great. I could easily have gone another 2 hours, but I'm going to be respectful of your time and just say thank you both so much.
Thank you.